The next three speakers on the panel each represent one of the sub-regions of the European Harm Reduction Network, and each is now going to quickly give an introduction into what the challenges are in their own sub-region, whether that's north, south or east. So I'd like to hand over to Peter to go first. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. I represent the Eurasian Harm Reduction Network here, which is an umbrella organization for 450 organizational and individual members from 29 countries of Central Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And my first thought today is that I was given a flyer when I entered the building by a group. I think it was Parents Against Drugs, and the flyer said that the Swiss harm reduction policy does not work, it's not effective. And my first thought was that maybe we should invite them to Eastern Europe, to Central Asia, to see what are the devastating consequences of not having liberal and harm reduction based policies. Because I think what I'm going to talk now about is that what happens when countries don't fund harm reduction programs. Actually, in the last decade, there was a quite significant improvement or scaling up of services all over the region. For example, in 2003, there were not much more than 200 needle and syringe exchange programs in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And just 7 years later, in 2010, there were 8 times more needle exchange program only in Ukraine. So actually, there was a very significant scaling up, but this improvement is mostly thanks to the Global Fund grants. Actually, the Strategic Investment and Impact Department of the Global Fund made an investment analysis of harm reduction spendings in the region recently, and this analysis showed that actually national governments fund in average only 8% of harm reduction spendings in the region. So actually still most of the harm reduction spendings are coming from international donors in most of the countries of the region. And still, if you count how much money is spent on harm reduction per injecting drug users in these countries, it's still very low. It's far from adequate. For example, in Georgia, in Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, there is less than $50 US per year per drug user spent on harm reduction in these countries. This situation, as Susie mentioned, is changing a lot right now. So actually the Global Fund is withdrawing. There is a significant reduction of Global Fund money, and this will result in less countries will be eligible to Global Fund in the region. Actually, in the next 3 years, most of the countries in the region will lose or won't be eligible anymore for Global Fund money. And this will have very devastating consequences on harm reduction spendings unless national governments will take over the role of the Global Fund. And actually, I think this is where advocacy should focus right now, on the national governments. And some people may think that if a country becomes a member of the European Union, or at least a candidate for European Union membership, then maybe the situation will improve. But actually the opposite is true, because the closer a country gets to the EU membership, actually the funding situation of NGOs is worsening. For example, a good example is Romania. It's now inside of the European Union, and actually after Global Fund, after it became not eligible for Global Fund money, there was a very significant reduction of funding for needle exchange programs, and there is now a rising HIV epidemic, very rapidly growing HIV epidemic among injecting drug users in Romania. And all this Central European region, before it was a very low prevalence HIV region, and now this situation is changing. Someone will talk about the situation in Greece today, where there is also an HIV epidemic, but we can see what's happening in Bulgaria, for example, where the number of new HIV infections grew 50% from one year to another, and this is also because of lack of funding for harm reduction programs. So the financial crisis have also devastating impact inside of the European Union, especially in the Eastern Central European part of the European Union. We made a short study on how this financial crisis impacted needle exchange programs in a few European Union countries, and actually most of the Central Eastern European countries there was a steady decline of funding for needle exchange, especially in Hungary, Romania, Serbia and Bulgaria. In my own country, Hungary, for example, there was a 35% reduction in the distributed sterile needles between 2012 and 2013. It's not only about lack of funds sometimes, but also lack of political support for harm reduction. In some countries now, instead of decriminalizing drug use, actually there are like strengthening or harshening punishments for drug users. In my own country, for example, there were restrictions on the punishments for drug users in the criminal code last year. The same is happening now in Bulgaria. So there is also a trend, a popularistic trend in politics that is going to the negative way. And if you want to see what difference harm reduction can make, it's good, for example, to compare Ukraine and Russia. In Russia, you know, OST, opiate substitution programs are illegal. There is very few money going to harm reduction. Actually, the government does not support harm reduction programs at all. And now it is one of the few countries where there is still a rapidly growing HIV epidemic among injecting drug users. While in Ukraine, the Ukrainian government made significant efforts to scale up harm reduction programs. And now, actually, there were reductions in the rate of HIV among ID use. Now, these developments, I think, are now under a threat because of politics. A good example is what's happening now in Crimea, where after the Russian occupation, the Russian government's first decision was to ban opiate substitution programs in that region. There are like 800 clients for opiate substitution programs in the Crimea, and all of them will actually lose their access to opiate substitution treatment unless the international community will not step in. And I think internationally, the growing Russian political influence in global drug policy is a real threat for harm reduction also in Europe. There is also a trend, I think, which is like changing markets, changing drug markets in Central Eastern Europe, especially in, for example, Romania and Hungary, where heroin is disappearing from the market. And now it's mostly stimulant drugs that are injected, new psychoactive substances. For example, in Hungary now, only 1 or 2% of injecting drug users use heroin, and most of them use new psychoactive stimulants instead of heroin, and this is a real serious challenge for the whole treatment system for harm reduction programs. And we should also speak about the problem of marginalized Roma communities in the region. The most concentrated hepatitis C epidemics are among marginalized Roma injecting drug users, and who face systemic discrimination in all areas of life. And I think this issue is not addressed adequately in international discussions. I think this is for the introduction.
Thank you very much. Eberhard, do you want to? Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Peter. José, if you want to go next.
Okay, thank you. So, I will start to speak in a different way. I hope that I'm not completely, an outsider on this panel. But the idea is to present, from my perspective, what was more or less the evolution of some main figures on harm reduction field. So I will start to talk about activism and activist role. Then I will pass to the manager or the professional of harm reduction. And then I will speak a little bit about the researchers. So I could say, so if you look back to the history of harm reduction in Europe, especially for the northern countries and like the Netherlands, the UK and so on, and even in Germany, we could see that in a very strong civil society, with a very strong liberal opinion, it was capable, it was feasible to appear a movement like the harm reduction movement. Based on the community suffering, based on the community idea that we could, or they could, you know, try to develop new response that will be more effective than the response given by the state, or given by the medical professionals, or given by the health system on that period. Some people, mainly users, we must say that, mainly users in the beginning, and then some professionals, you know, also join them in this movement. They start to develop these kind of strategies like the needle exchange programs, or even OST, not OST in that time, but okay, but needle exchange programs. And with that, they force the state, they force the establishment, the governments to open a new kind of procedures that was not, you know, yet established, and that was not yet, you know, understanding as a feasible and as a political and correct response from the health system. Saying this, we must say that this was the time of the activists. This was the time of the street heroes, the people coming from the ground that were capable to claiming for the civil rights, claiming for their human rights, and trying to push forward on those times the boundaries of the health system and social protection system. To claim and to reivindicate some kind of a response from society is like to be in a political pure state. And that was more or less like that. These were, you know, the Marvel heroes. These were the founding fathers or the founding mothers of the harm reduction movement. And then some countries start, as you know, as well as me, they start to give money. They start to fund it, this kind of claiming. They start to open response like the needle exchange programs, the consumption rooms, the opioid substitution therapies, the heroin prescription like in Switzerland and so on. Some countries and some governments, they start to rely and to believe on these new movements, on these new kind of strategies. And then these activists, so many of these activists, they turn out on managers, on professionals. And this is not so bad at all. That means that they were now responsible for managing the money given by the public state to them to be more effective with some population that were suffering. That means that these professionals, these managers, these people like a grand majority of you and of me, or Eberhard, for example, were obliged to develop these kind of skills, management skills. We were obliged to develop communication skills, negotiation skills. We were obliged to run for money each year or each 2 years. We were obliged to manage services. And we were obliged to behave like technocrats. And that is not so glamorous. That is not so brilliant. That is a bureaucrat and a very technocrat role. That's the gray role that normally no one wants to take in society. But this at the same time was, from my point of view, the affirming existence of harm reduction. This was the moment when harm reduction became a part of the system. So we were established by the governments and by ourselves, and at the same time we became a part of the establishment. And when we are a part of the establishment, then it's more difficult to continue in a claiming position. We cannot claiming anymore, or at least all the time, because you cannot struggle all the time with your donor. That is not clever. That is not a very intelligent position. You cannot fight with them or with him, it depends on the donor. Because if you do that, then you can lose your trust, you can lose your commitment that you have made with this particular person or this particular structure, like the government or like an international donor. And more than that, you start to be evaluated by them, and you need to present results, and you need to stand for your results, because then you need to defend your professionals, but you also need to defend your community of people that you want to serve. But in the meanwhile, from my perspective, some of us, we lost the track. We lost, the conscience that we were, no more defending the community of people in suffering, but we are trying to defending our own position. We were trying to defending our own services, and knowing, not being so aware of the effectiveness of our response, and especially creating a gap between the community that was suffering and ourselves. Perhaps we were defending more the technocracy, the bureaucracy, and the relationship between us and the state, between us and the donor, than the relationship between us and our community. And for me, that was one of the main concerns, or one of the main errors that we have committed in the last years. For example, if you look to Portugal, even Italy, Spain or France, you can see, not Spain, but Italy, Portugal, France or even Greece, you can see a very centralized and strong state. In these kind of countries, like my country, civil society was not so strong. So everything was designed, everything was set up top-down, from the government to the civil society. They were designing, in the beginning, the structures and the facilities that we should, build up on the ground. They were designing the way to proceed. They were designing the methodologies. Even they were designing, or they were conceiving the concepts. And civil society was receiving that in a very primitive stage. But at the same time that we are receiving this kind of methodology and that we are receiving this kind of funding to work, we start to develop a conscience. 1 minute, okay. And with that, I think that in the south part of Europe, what happened now, and because of also of the crisis, then I will come back to that in the second round, what happened with the countries like Portugal, Spain, France, and so on, is that civil society appears in the second stage, and they start to realize, we start to realize that we can have a role, and we can fight, and we should fight for our rights and rights of our community. Yet we are still very over-professionalized in the way we approach our community, and for me that's one of the gaps we must bridge on.
Thank you very much. So just finally on the challenges then, Eberhard?
Yeah, thank you. I will approach the issue a little bit different once again, because my background is a very practical one. I'm a social worker. I worked in the field of harm reduction for many years, and in the last couple of years I'm organizing European projects on this issue. I'm representing the western part of the European Harm Reduction Network, so I started a very little survey under our focal points in the different countries, asking them what are their challenges in their particular country, and also a question on the funding situation. So as a result, I got answers from a couple of countries, and I think it is quite interesting just briefly to mention what is going to happen in this in a couple of countries. And I think as a consequence or as a summary, because we can also substrate or bring a definition to what will be the challenges for all of us in Europe in regard of harm reduction. We will, by the way, make a more exhaustive, comprehensive survey on challenges in harm reduction under our members at the end of May, and we will present the results on the website and in the Amsterdam conference beginning of October. So that will be much more comprehensive. That is just a spotlight, but I think it reflects very well the picture of what is going on in harm reduction in different European countries. To starting with the Netherlands, and I think this is a very nice example how harm reduction getting into this management function, not really connected to the ground anymore. That's a tendency, or what happened in the Netherlands, one of the let's say the founders of harm reduction in Europe, that harm reduction almost disappeared from daily work, because health services anyway are merged to large conglomerates, and it is almost not detectable anymore. So also our colleagues at the Rainbow Foundation work with 180 staff members. Many of the younger colleagues not even know the term harm reduction anymore, and they're not knowing that what they are doing is harm reduction. So the term disappeared almost totally out of the discussion, and you can address it as an advantage because it's so integrated that you don't need to speak about it anymore. But of course it has also a large aspect of disadvantage because it can also disappear, and that partly is happening also in the Netherlands. For the rest, in terms of policy developments, it is also that, let's say, this liberal approach, giving more responsibilities to individuals, the social systems making a step behind, and so on. That is a very large tendency in the Netherlands. And as you know, we are the country with the most drug consumption rooms, and I know that many countries would like to have just one, or at least starting with just one drug consumption room, which is a very important and a measure for harm reduction. But we also have to address in the harm reduction community the control function, for example, of consumption rooms. As you might know, in '98, when we established drug consumption rooms in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, the police was the main promoter of consumption rooms. Why? Because it also fulfills a public order function. And as a harm reduction community, I think we have to address it, and we have to see how the system works for us or not. So that's about the Netherlands, and what we as harm reduction communities, a small organization, still reflect themselves as harm reduction. We need a strong, better cooperation with authorities, with governments. There is no harm reduction platform in the Netherlands. It really is a reliable counterpart for decision makers. Moving just to another country, and I'm grateful to Tim Bingham, our dear colleague, who gave me some information about Ireland. Many organizations in Ireland faced budget cut in the last year, and which is leading to the cuts in frontline service provision. However, there is a large pharmacy needle exchange program in Ireland, and as you know, Ireland is a very restrictive and conservative country when it comes to drug policies, but nearly 100 pharmacies across the country providing injecting equipment in Ireland, so that is an advantage. Tim addressed some challenges for Ireland, and that is obviously to keep specialized needle exchange services open. They also feel the need for specialized service for those that use steroids, funding for the recommendations for the Hep C strategy. They developed a very nice hepatitis C strategy, but of course now the next step would be to fund it appropriate. Funding to provide naloxone as a change in the law to enable wide accessibility and to develop an overdose strategy in that country. And in fact, due to the economic crisis, more people are injecting now in the streets, and there would be the need to have safer injecting facilities. Another country with a very diverse picture is Belgium. There is not really right now a serious threat for budget cuts, for example, for low threshold sample services, but the situation is very different in the different cities. And if you speak about Antwerp, where Tessa from the Free Clinic gave me some information, Antwerp has a very right-wing local government, and as if local projects are relying on local funding, they have a big problem right now in that country. So their challenges for harm reduction is that the funding should not be only rely on funding from the city environment, but also from the government. Drug consumption rooms are high on the agenda of Belgian harm reduction services, and also to integrate and to establish a relation with recovery movements or recovery services would be a very high on the agenda for Belgium. Scotland, also very interesting, has no significant fundings on harm reduction projects, and their challenges are once again recovery and how to collaborate with recovery services and harm reduction. They address hepatitis C, as many of you might know. Hepatitis policies in Scotland are very extended and can function as a model of good practice for many countries in Europe. However, they address hepatitis as a challenge again. They address the problem around aging and drug users. They address new psychoactive substances. They address prison issues, and also overdose prevention strategies. 1 minute, okay. UK, I can be brief, also very briefly, the recovery agenda, and I think UK is a country where really recovery is invented on ideological reasons in first instance, and not so much on budgetary or financial reasons, and that is quite a fight the colleagues on harm reduction have to fight in UK and their relation to recovery. Sweden also, let me just briefly name Sweden, because they have some increase in substitution treatment. As you know, Sweden, one of the most restrictive countries in Europe, they have 5 needle exchange programs, which is an advantage for that country, and they do quite a good work on hepatitis C. The challenge for the Swedish people, and the Swedish Drug User Union provided me with that information, is the government that it has to accept that harm reduction is really an integral part of the policy, and to understand much better still the user perspective of policies. And last not least, Germany, in terms of budget, there are no big issues right now. They have a shift of policies in terms of reintegration projects, and many harm reduction services also work on reintegration. So there might be problems in terms of budget there, but as challenges for harm reduction they addressed, and Astrid and Dirk provided me with this information. Again, NPS and consumption, changing consumption patterns, alcohol harm reduction, migrants, models for regulation of cannabis, hepatitis C strategy, which is available but has to be funded, prison issues, and also the coverage of services also in a country like Germany is an issue there. So I think in the discussion now we can filter out some challenges for harm reduction which are valid for all of us.
Thank you, Eberhard. So we've talked a lot about the challenges, and it's good to have a good moan. It's therapeutic sometimes just to talk about everything that's going wrong, but I think now is the important question, which I pose to the panel, is what are the opportunities? What are the solutions? And where do we go now to address some of the things that you've identified? Susie, I don't know if you want to go first? Just a few minutes from each of you, I think.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. I've kind of got a few random ideas. Let me begin. One is, I don't know whether the harm reduction movement, for want of a better term, I don't know whether people identify themselves as belonging to that, but those of us with an interest and a concern for access to harm reduction services for drug users, if European governments, member states who are also donors for international development, understood that there was a constituency, voters amongst their population that really cared about people's access to harm reduction in developing countries, that would be really important. One of the kind of the problems that we work with all the time is this kind of political unpopularity of harm reduction. And so we often find that we're dealing with donors who are committed to harm reduction in a variety of different ways, but it's almost like it's a below-the-radar commitment. So with the notable exception of the Netherlands government, who are very open and very proud about their international investments in harm reduction, I think we could be asking more from our governments about, or certainly sending strong signals to our governments about, you invest in harm reduction domestically, what are your investments in harm reduction internationally? Particularly those governments that have been clear and bold with their domestic investments in harm reduction. I just wanted to acknowledge really from José's comments about the different dynamics in terms of civil society development and harm reduction development, and to reflect on Eberhard's comments about the way harm reduction is characterised or managed, say, in the Netherlands now. You know, there's an interesting question for me that comes from all of, and certainly when I watch the work that's being done in Eastern Europe by the European Harm Reduction Network and others, there's an interesting set of questions for me about how we mobilise a greater civil society support for harm reduction domestically and internationally. And I don't just mean ourselves, those of us who are part of harm reduction services or receive harm reduction services or provide harm reduction services or whatever, or those of us who are activists in drug policy reform, but I mean a wider set. I think there's a challenge for all of us about building greater political support for harm reduction outside of our obvious networks, and I think civil society organisations are the best organisations to build that wider constituency of support.
Thank you. José?
Okay, yeah. So, from my perspective, I think we could go in both ways, or two ways. One, we should come back to the basics, to our communities, and we should start to strengthen them once again, work with them, not only to them, but with them. And that's a different thing, meaning that, for example, we should meaningfully involve drug users in decision process, you know, about harm reduction strategies and so on. We should give them more and more a voice on these strategies. And somehow, and sometimes, we are not doing that in a proper way. Another thing is concerning next generations, and this reminds me a conference of IRA about the next generation. We didn't transfer, we didn't pass the enough knowledge, information, the enough history of harm reduction to the next generation. So we didn't train them, we didn't prepare them, you know, about the past, so they can be, you know, more capable to face the present and the future. And we also forgot, from my perspective, you know, the ideological speech, the values of human rights or civil liberties, and we forgot basic things like freedom, liberty, equality, universal access to treatment, and so on. We became a little bit lazy, bourgeois, let's say. I'm autocritical about myself, and we forgot to address the governments, we forgot to address the decision makers with this kind of values, you know, with this kind of speech, and we are not putting enough pressure on them. At the same time, we are also very incapable to deal with press and media, for example. We are not using that. We are not using quite well the new media, for example, social media, blogs and so on the blogosphere, on the internet, and on the web, sorry. So I think we should go more on this kind of direction. We should, to me, to push the boundaries somehow, is come back, you know, to the basic principles, taking into account the new generations of professionals, of users, and so on, into account the new ways of using drugs, new kinds of drugs, and so on. So there is a lots of challenge, you know, that we are facing in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, Eurasian Harm Reduction Network currently runs a campaign that's Harm Reduction Works funded. And it goes simultaneously in many countries of the region, and actually it aims to target national governments to increase or to provide sustainable funding and take over the role of the global fund in the region. the international community should be much more vocal when it comes to, for example, the role Russia plays. Just to tell you an example, now there will be an Eastern European Central Asian conference in Moscow, and UNAIDS is one of the sponsors of that conference, and now many NGOs are asking UNAIDS not to support this conference because Russia's negative role on harm reduction. But still UNAIDS will go there and be one of the main sponsors of this conference. So I think international organizations, UN organizations, EU could do much more to you know, pressure these governments in Eastern Europe, and also the European Union. In my own country, in Hungary, the largest needle exchange program is now under political attack. One of the mayors of Hungary wants to shut down the largest needle exchange program, and there is no word from any EU institutions about that. This is clearly against the European drug strategy and action plan, so we really have to do much more to implement all these documents.
Thank you.
Following on European strategies and so on, we both work together also in the Civil Society Forum on Drugs. It sounds better than it is, because in terms of influence it is not really influential, but anyway there is a kind of parliament of NGOs all over Europe in regard of drug policies on European level, and we work together there also with the broad spectrum of all represented organizations, from prohibition to decriminalization or regulation of markets. So it is at least a very interesting experience. And sorry, during the years, oh shit, you know, during somewhat. During the years, at least what we achieved, from my opinion, is that we achieved a work relation with the entire forum and these different perspectives. So Heino was addressing that harm reduction should get more radical once again, and I'm very happy with that. And it is, for me also, is much more fun to be more radical. But on the other hand, you also, and this is maybe also a challenge for harm reduction, to reach out better to other stakeholders, because we meet each other here on this conference, European Harm Reduction Conference, International Harm Reduction Conference, and we are a community. We don't need to convince each other. We exchange information and we speak about drug policy reform, but there is no one in the room who will be convinced. Everyone already knows about that, and I think that is something we have to improve. Sorry, I have some more points, but maybe sorry. Yeah.
It's a sign that the panels talk too long when they all lose their voices. Okay, well, we're just about at time now, so just one last open question to the panel, if there's any last points that you want to, that maybe you haven't got across already. Susie?
Thank you, Jamie, for one last word. I don't know whether this topic, whether the UNGAS on drugs is on the agenda of this conference or not, and I don't know whether those kinds of UN processes mean a lot to everyone. But for those of us who are policy wonks, the policy process towards new international mechanisms for drug control is ahead of us on the horizon. And when I say, make these kind of quite generic comments about civil society and other organizations, both inside Europe, on the edges of Europe, and outside Europe, working together as part of a harm reduction movement, we have a very clear and unified goal, which is for better drug policy, and the moment for that is UNGAS. So I just wanted to talk about that as a big opportunity for us all to work more directly. Drug users in Malaysia and harm reduction providers in Indonesia and all of you guys.
There's, I think, the Friday in the programme, there's going to be discussions about the UNGAS and on drug policy reform in the plenary and in the workshops, so hopefully we can carry that on Friday. José, did you have anything else? No?
Okay, so only to say that also forgot to talk about the grassroots professionals also. Grassroots professionals, and many of us that are here attending this kind of conference, sometimes I think we have this idea that we are listening or hearing people that talk to know up to the sky, something like that. You know, that when we talk about young gas, United Nations, very important, I know, European Commission and so on, we tend to forget sometimes that we also need to address the grassroots professionals, to address once again this kind of community of professionals. And from my point of view, one of the things that I could see, not only in Portugal but around Europe, it was the lack of professional identity of these people. You know, lots of them, they don't know very well what it means to be an harm reduction professional. And that's a very important point, honestly.
Okay, okay. Peter, did you have anything
Just
final?
a quick thought. I would like to echo what Elliot said in the opening, that now drug policies are changing very fast in the global scale, and something will replace the criminalization paradigm. And but it's not. It's very important what will replace it. Is it a medicalization or is it something else? And I think this will be the greatest challenge for the harm reduction movement in the future.
Thank you. And Eberhard, is your voice feeling better?
Well, I just want something what is absolutely not new, and all of you know, but I think also in regard of concrete actions, I think hepatitis C and is really momentum to increase all our efforts to work for better hepatitis C policies and practices, because as you know, with new medications and also in terms of awareness of international organizations, WHO and everyone, so I think every one of us should intensify the work on hepatitis. Thank you.
Thank you, Eberhard. Okay, thank you all very much for attending this panel discussion. Thank you very much to the panel. Round of applause, please, for the panel once again. Most of the topics that were raised here, there's going to be lots of opportunities in the other sessions, in the workshops, for more discussion, more kind of debate around these issues. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a lovely conference. Thank you.